we can't just limit animal advocacy to non-human animals. We do have to mention, what about the farm workers? What about the people who you might not want to think about that are committing these harsh things towards these animals? Like, unfortunately, as bad as it does feel, because they're enacting these factory farming crimes, like, I do have to still think about them and like their realities, because at the end of the day, I'm blaming corporations and the CEOs for these things. I wish there were more nonprofits in the world that were just like also focusing on human liberation and just collective liberation for all, regardless of race, gender, class.
Unashamedly universal, isn't it? It's like everybody, right?
Yeah, it's like that's how it should be.
Hey, Noel, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Yeah, great. Thank you. Great. I know you're in Florida, so things are a bit tough for the stay up there at the moment, but we chatted a bit before, and it's good to hear that at least you and your family are sort of out of range of what's going on. But yeah, thoughts going out to everybody impacted. It's a tough day.
Yes, it's surprisingly very sunny up here in North Florida, but I woke up to seeing some of the footage that Hurricane Milton left in its path, and it doesn't look good down there, but hopefully, I'm not sure where the eye is projected to be at the moment, but hopefully it's making its way out of Florida, or at least like soon to be.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you, despite what's going on, for making the time to talk to me today. And I came across you first because of your piece in Vox. I'm a black vegan. Why don't you see more of us? Which is part of that wonderful package put together by a previous guest, Marina Bolotnikova, too. And so I loved your piece and reached out. And it's great to get the chance to talk to you and understand a little bit about your sort of philosophical journey and how you think about some of the issues you touched on in the piece now. But as I've explained to you before, I guess this is a series of conversations about what I think of as some of the deepest philosophical questions. And the ones I tend to focus on include what's real, how do we understand what's true, the sort of the nature of reality, if you like, that sort of classic deep question. But just as importantly, the questions of ethics, what matters and who matters, what are good and bad and right and wrong, those types of things even mean. And I have an obvious bias because I'm trying to popularize and develop this worldview called sentientism, which is a really broad, pluralistic worldview that tries to answer those questions. And it does it by saying, with the what's real question, let's use evidence and reason as a sort of broadly naturalistic approach to understanding the world around us. And when it comes to the ethical questions, it's pretty pluralistic and open-minded, but it does insist that every sentient being, every being that can feel or experience things, should matter seriously in our moral consideration. And I'm also very excited because I've just had a mug made with the worldview.
Nice.
It's very exciting.
This color scheme, yeah.
Yeah, it's very orange. My wife tells me it looks like too much like the Sainsbury's logo, which is a chain of supermarkets over here, but they haven't sued me yet. Yeah, so that's roughly what the worldview is about, and I guess that's inspired these series of conversations. But in the conversations, I'm talking to a wide range of people, many of whom disagree with different bits of sentientism too. So I'm not just talking to people who agree. So it'll be fascinating to understand your own sort of journey through those big questions. But before we go on to those, how would you best introduce yourself for people who haven't come across you or your work so far?
So my name is Noella Williams. I am based in Brooklyn, New York, but I'm from North Florida, specifically Pensacola. I am a vegan as of 5 years, but I'm mostly right. Veganism is just a big part of my life as far as when it comes to writing, because of course that's like how I ended up on this podcast now. And it's just like been a huge lifestyle change, especially just like becoming more of a foodie, and that like experience of just getting to become familiar with how veganism has changed me has also been reflected in my writing. So I think like that is very intertwined in who I am. Some of the things I cover in my work include like culture, as far as it's to Black culture or to the queer community. I've also covered music and politics and food, a little home and lifestyle. I kind of just tell people I want to write about whatever interests me, whether it's something I've covered or not, because some stuff really does feel like uncharted territory for me. Like I recently started writing about video games, but honestly, if I'm interested in it, it'll flow. And I mean, writing this article about being a Black vegan is maybe my fourth or fifth article about veganism. And so it was like so easy for it to flow. And I think that's just a reflection of like how much I talk about like veganism and like I literally am now. But yeah, in my free time, I try to do some bird watching, get outside. I do tend to have a lot more indoor hobbies, such as like consuming different TV shows or movies. But yeah, I feel like that's my range of like a very surface level of myself.
No, that's a great intro. Thank you. Are you still out catching Pokemon these days as well, or is that
I do it every now and then.
along with
I
the bird
love
watching?
telling people like, of course, it's out there with the bird watching. As I'm out here in Florida, I actually visited a cavern for the first time on Monday, and it definitely felt like that is somewhere I could come across some Pokemon, like specifically like a Diglett or Dig Trio or something. Truly.
Yeah, your mention of it inspired me to log back into my Pokemon Go account after quite a long while. So
Nice.
yeah, yeah. So that's a lovely intro. Thank you so much for giving us a sort of sense of your eclectic writing interest. Hopefully, people will go and dig out some of your articles, and we can point people to them later on. But let's get on to these really deep philosophical questions. So the first one is what's real, and in a technical sense, that's might be epistemology, right? How do we know stuff more than what do we believe? And for many of my guests, a good way into that topic, because it's so broad, is to explore their personal histories with respect to things like religion and the supernatural, and whether they grew up originally in a more religious context or a spiritual context, or one that was maybe more scientific or atheistic or agnostic or something in the middle, and how that side of their thinking about sort of deep questions about the nature of reality have changed, if they have at all. So I don't know if you want to wind the clock back to tell a little bit of that story about how do you think about reality?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in, like I mentioned, the Pensacola, Florida. It is the Bible Belt for those who know. And the Bible Belt, there is so many in America. I mean, as I've moved to places like Boston and New York on the East Coast, I've realized like the Northeast has their own Bible Belt, but the South absolutely has one. And so I grew up in a Black Baptist church. I went to a predominantly, I would say, actually, it was all Christian school. It was a Christian school that I attended from kindergarten to eighth grade. And so I had like a huge time, like involvement in church, whether it was in school, just learning scriptures and strictly anything about Christianity or being involved in like their choir or a piano, like everything had its basis in Christianity. And in on Sundays and Wednesdays, I also went to church. And I grew up in a Baptist church, but eventually in high school attended a non-denominational church. So I would say it was pretty much Christian the entire time, specifically like Baptist in that pocket. So I definitely grew up religious. Both my parents are religious. They're both Caribbean, so I'm not really sure where their path of religion starts. But I know that for me, it started when I was young, being baptized, like everything, I mean, knowing the Lord's Prayer is probably deep in my mind somewhere, all of that. And I am not religious anymore. I would say I discovered I was probably agnostic like in 2018. So about a year after I graduated high school and wasn't really like going to church as much anymore. And that actually also coincided with me going vegan and realizing I was queer. And so I feel like just a lot of things, like, I guess, like kind of development, identity changes happening at once. And one of them was like religion.
Yeah. And when you were a kid, how did you engage with it? Was it just like, the water you swam in and it was just the things you did and the things you believed and that was it? Or even at that stage, were you sort of interrogating it a little bit, challenging it, questioning it, exploring it? Or was it just like you just went along with it because that's what everybody did around you?
I would say it's more of what I knew and breathed and slept with. Like that was like everything I knew as a kid. I think I started questioning things maybe more in high school and perhaps actually like middle school started a little, but that's also because the school that I went to had you like sign like this special thing talking about these are the only, I don't know how to say it, like these like very strict set of rules, like no secular music, no engaging in any drugs or anything, alcohol. I mean, we're in middle school, so it's like probably the most developmental period of your youth, let alone like interest in things start forming and like influence from the internet. So they had us sign that in eighth grade, and I was like, this is kind of wild. And along with just thinking about like the misogyny in like biblical texts was on my mind a lot. And so I guess with all of that in conjunction, I started questioning things in middle school, but I would say high school is when I actually started pushing back on things.
Yeah. And you mentioned the misogyny as one of the factors. And in the conversations I've had with people so far, I mean, some are still religious, some have found a different path, but the ones who've moved away from a religious worldview, whether that's Christianity or something else, it seems like there's been sort of two types of things that have driven that journey. One is the sort of more technical evidence and reason stuff. You know, they might just start to think, well, this doesn't seem like it's true. You know, it seems like these things were more human created than divinely created. So that's more about the facts and the evidence. But there's also a strong theme of seeing some problematic ethics come through some of those worldviews as well. And on the one hand, they're hearing about love their neighbor as themselves, but then they're seeing whether it's misogyny, sexism, racism, bigotry against other worldviews, cruel and harsh punishment. There's a bunch of different ethical things that turn them away. What was the mix for you? Was it both of those types of things, or was it more the sort of moral challenges you saw?
I think for me, I guess that just thinking about how, whether it's like religious figures, such as like a pastor, use the Bible as a text to justify, like, I don't know, for example, a wife submitting to a husband, or things that felt like, very in charge by a man, things were something I was like, I don't know if like this feels like something I'm interested in now that I'm like developing like a personality and brains and like learning about how misogyny can affect women in real life. So that is something I noticed just felt a little off while reading text when I was younger. I guess I didn't really think about much more than that. I think the homophobia eventually came along, just like how a lot of biblical stuff is very like man and woman, and that also just didn't feel like aligning with, former texts that are like, loving thy neighbor regardless of whatever. And so
Yeah, you set that stuff against the quotes from Leviticus, and it's like,
yeah. Yeah. So I'm like, yeah, these were written by different prophets, and I mean, I don't know how much biblical knowledge I'm hiding in the back of my brain in some folder right now, but I know things were written by different prophets, and I know I can't generalize the Bible as a whole. But again, yeah, looking at like two different chapters and verses, it's like there's a little bit of like irony here with how different these things that are being said are, and how that felt like a little like, okay, well, maybe this isn't something I should use to guide my life, let alone like my moral compass.
yeah. And what was that? So you shifted in high school. It sounds like towards being more agnostic. And
Yeah.
how would you describe that agnosticism? Because some people use it in genuinely, I just don't know either way. Some will say it's not something we could ever know. It's just unknowable. I'm quite comfortable describing myself as an atheist, but because I'm just pretty confident there aren't any gods. But in a way, that's just sort of a stronger form of agnosticism, because I think it's possible. I just think it's very unlikely. So, what sort of flavor of agnosticism do you think you got to in high school, and where are you now?
So I feel like the interest was kind of inching to me at the end of high school. And I was just like, well, my father has a rule that's like, as long as I was in his house, like I have to go to church Wednesday, Sundays. Like that's the usual when it comes to like, I feel like a lot of Black families, like other people I've spoke to that are Black and agnostic or atheists and just like not religious anymore, forms of religious trauma, just like thinking about how I was forced to go to church probably resulted in why I don't really like going to church. But I would say I don't know much, and I don't care to know much more. I don't think it's something like, I think I tell people all the time, I think if I could go back and like just go to school, maybe not rewind and not have a journalism degree, but if I could just get any degree and it wouldn't really cost money, it would just be education, which is literally like reading a book. I would love to be a theology major and just like focus on like, maybe music because I love gospel music. Like I think it's very important when musicians grow up in the church. I think like theology as a major sounds exciting and I would love to study it if I didn't have to think about like how much a degree costs. But as far as me learning more about my Gnosticism and like, do I think there could be more things out there? I don't think that's really something I'm too concerned about at the moment. Maybe it'll be an interest of mine. I think I have other things I want to learn about first, than thinking back on religion more after most of my life was spent doing that. And so I think that I also feel like I call the universe or earth like using she, her pronouns, like Mother Earth, the universe, she's guiding me with her stars, like whatever like that. I feel like that feels a little more comfortable for me than I guess calling God this father figure, but also this guiding figure that isn't a father brother. I think I was confused by how Jesus and God were the son and father when I was younger. Now I think I get it a little more, but I don't want to use either of those. And also just being agnostic, but I don't think I'm full atheist. I mean, it would be crazy if I was like an atheist, but loved Greek mythology so much. And whole time there's like Greek gods out there, and I'm like, they don't exist. But the part of me that loves escapism and fantasy is like, maybe they exist. I wouldn't know. I'm not going to go read more about it because that's just not my interest in books right now. But I don't know. I enjoy like Greek mythology, and I would love to learn more about like African spirituality and like more about like gods in other like countries and cultures. I think more so I want to learn less about Christianity and think like less about Christianity and how that affects me. I think the religious trauma and upbringing makes me interested in other cultures and countries, gods, goddesses, and their religious lore compared to Christianity.
Yeah, you've done your fair share of Christianity already. So yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, thank you.
Maybe
So
I'll go back.
yeah, yeah. And I find religions and different worldviews absolutely fascinating as well. But I think you're right. You can have a fascination in culture and music and in the stories without necessarily having to believe things are true. I think that works fine. And you talked about thinking about, the Mother Earth and there being, some more sort of amorphous sense there. That's quite common amongst my guests as well, because some people will move from a religious worldview to being a sort of classic, boring, sort of atheistic, naturalistic person like me. And I do leave the door open for, some more mystical stuff going on. I just think it's very, very unlikely. I think, reality is awesome enough and this is just it, right? So that's fine with me. But quite a lot of people have moved away from an established religion, sometimes because of the religious trauma or the moral things, but have found their way to something that might be, not religious, but spiritual in some broader sense. And even there's different flavors, because some people, I might call some of the way I think about reality spiritual, almost it's a walking through a forest or, enjoying nature. But mine is a spirituality without believing there's any spirits. So I don't think there's any magic, going on. I don't think there's really beings out there, and I don't think nature is a being in that sense. Whereas other people will take a spiritual sense that is more mystical and supernatural. There is a sense that the earth actually is a being, or there are supernatural things out there. I don't want to sort of force you too much, but what's your sense in that space? Is there still some openness to the supernatural there? And what would lead you one way or the other? Yeah.
Yeah, I have grown up consuming so much vampire lore that I can't even say part of me, like all of me wishes that vampires and werewolves, whatever are real. I don't know if I'd want to come across one actually.
Yeah.
But I have so much interest in like supernatural. When it comes to bridging the gap of like whether it's real, I think that's just me needing to read more again, like African deity. Like, I mean, New Orleans is up the street from my hometown, like 3 hours away, thinking about voodoo and hoodoo and all of that. I 100% believe in witchcraft and just like people like just channeling their ancestors and their families and passing down all of this wisdom through, potions and spells. And I couldn't tell you anything more about like what I know. But yeah, I think it's like nice when someone practices witchcraft, when something that their ancestors are doing. When it comes to anything past witches, I don't know how I feel about ghosts. It's something I haven't really given a thought of. I think that I can believe people when they feel a spirit lingering on. I mean, whether you're in a old house, you're in a cemetery, you're in just like an interesting part of the world where there's a lot of history and a lot of maybe trauma. I can believe if someone feels like they feel a spirit or just something like lingering. I don't think I have enough expertise to either to shut someone down when they're feeling that, to invalidate them, or to also fully wholeheartedly believe them. I think that it's more so like I'm glad that you feel like you could connect with the earth that way and like the supernatural. I'm a little jealous. I wish I could like go in a room and like feel like, I don't know, they think they're called like a poltergeist. Like, not like I would want that job. I'm not signing up for it or applying, but I think it's interesting. I think that's just a lot of my fascination with like supernatural lore coming in. I've always had an interest, like that's never gonna go away. I love escapism and sci-fi and fantasy. So I think when it comes to believing these things, I will always.
Yeah, you want to believe, even if deep down you might still be a bit skeptical. But yeah, but there's a fascination and there's an
Absolutely.
openness to it, and yeah, cool, interesting. So, one thing you can do is sort of just talk about the stuff you believe, but I also find it interesting to explore. Okay, why do we believe stuff? So, in a way, this sentientism worldview is suggesting we take a naturalistic approach using evidence and reason, scientific evidence, and it does include the evidence of our own, life course and our own personal experiences and our senses as well. So, it's not just about people in lab coats, right? It's a broad sense of evidence. And there's an interesting balance between people who are, quite focused on that type of stuff. So they might be fascinated in all sorts of other ideas, but they won't really believe them until there's something really strong, decent, strong classical evidence. But there are other things that pull people's beliefs as well, and that can be faith, it can be revelation, it can be a sort of really deep personal sense of something being true. So that balance is really interesting, and it feels like you're sort of pulled in a few different ways there, maybe. But we're going to talk in this conversation about some of the most contentious topics it's possible to talk about. But I think maybe the big one, the scariest one, is astrology. And I noticed in your bio, somewhat in a couple of places, you've talked about being a Pisces. What are your views on astrology as a sort of final question in this? Or what's real? Does that fall into that same camp?
It does. It does. I know the most of to the extent of my sign about Pisces, and that is it. Like I wish I knew more. It's again something that's just been on my to be read pile about learning more. I love that my friends can know so much about astrology and like what I think your six houses are. I know my big three, but only because of apps like CoStar or like asking my mom about my birth time and things where I did it just so I could keep up in a conversation and know like what my big three are. I also would say my knowledge to my sign also goes up to where I could like share like what I am with someone like a Pisces. But other than that, I definitely believe there's some truth to astrology and just like I mean, I think it's nice to get familiar with who you are and how like, as it relates to the stars and the water and universe and just like when you were born and etc. But I like can't say much more that I know of like about astrology and how it like affects my life personally.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. And I find it fascinating because on the one hand, you can see the fun of it and the links to sort of personality and different ways of thinking, and at the same time, I've got the sort of classical evidence reason part of my brain looking at the studies that just show it doesn't seem to work and have any effect or any insight or any mechanism at all. But I can still see the fun and the excitement in it. So yeah, thank you. Well, let's leave the what's real question and move on to the ethical questions. So the first one of these is about, I guess, what matters. And again, it'd be interesting to know, even from your earliest memories as a kid, how did you think about concepts like good and bad and right and wrong? How were they thought of in your family and society? And how have you come to think about the sort of roots of ethics, what really matters now?
I feel like good and bad were taught to me like the way they were taught to any child, like, there's no-nos and there's things that shouldn't be doing off limits, whether it's like getting involved in an adult's conversation, something that's like for, a higher age, or maybe it's like leaving a mess in your room, or maybe it's being unkind to someone, whether it's like at daycare, at school, at home, like these different levels of as you grow older, just showing kindness to people. And, the things that are good, like telling someone thank you, complimenting someone, saying hello to strangers. Like, I definitely realized Southern hospitality is a thing when I left New York, or when I moved to New York and left the South. And I feel like all that were things I was taught when I was younger, like always address everyone in the room, say hi to stranger, well, not say hi to strangers, but say hi to your neighbors and say hello to people when you come across them, meet them again, the whole like entering a room thing. So I feel like those were taught to me when I was younger as like good things. And it was like very easily divisions between what was good and what was bad.
Yeah. So there were some rules. There was some sort of politeness and civility stuff. But there was
Yes.
kindness as well. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
And did you get a sense of why those things were good or bad, or was it just, this is the fact of the matter, this is why they're good or bad? Did you have a sense of what was sitting underneath that?
I think I didn't really question it because like it felt good to be a nice person and it didn't feel good to hurt someone's feelings and be quote unquote bad. I think a lot of it was also rooted in biblical texts that I was learning at school and at home, like God loves thy neighbors, so you should also love your neighbors and be kind to them too. Just like the story with the oh my gosh, I'm trying to make sure I get these numbers right. 5 loaves and 2 fishes, or 3 loaves, 2 fishes, one of those. Just like
Yeah.
how God broke bread and shared with many people. Of course, he had this crazy magic trick of just to keep dividing things and fed a bunch of people. I don't know if I can do all that, but sharing with people, I think there's concepts of mutual aid and how mutual aid came to exist and how it can be related to like things like that story, like with God, or I think that was Jesus in the moment. I'm not sure, with him and the loaves and fishes. So I think a lot of this was me being taught through Bible school and Sunday school, just like being kind is a trait that Christians have, and or I don't need to get into why I think
Yeah.
that a
Yeah.
lot of Christians might
And
not, but yeah.
yeah, there's a different topic. And was your sense that the reason we should be good is because God commanded it? So it's more of an obedience thing. We're doing what we're told because God says it. Or was it more that we should be good because it's just intrinsically good to be kind, and maybe Jesus is showing us, through his example, how to do that?
That's a really good question because I think a lot of it is obedience, because when I was a bad kid or did something wrong or like misspoke, I don't know. My parents always pulled like the obedience or disobedience is worse than witchcraft, which I could not tell you what chapter that is, but it's definitely a Bible verse. So I think obedience and being an obedient child was really grained into me, which is just like, probably more religious trauma, honestly.
Yeah.
But it was like, you learn in the Bible, you learn at school, like obedience, being obedient to your parents and to like, I guess, authoritative figures is important. So personally, I guess that's how that was kind of ingrained into me. And like honesty being the best policy, like the golden rule, things that aren't really religious but are religious adjacent. I think another thing is, again, just being from the South, so many manners and politeness and being good and kind are so like ingrained in everything down here. And so I think what was the second half of your question was also good. Oh, because it makes you feel good. I think it's somewhere along the lines when you're being a good person and you're being, kind to your neighbors, kind to your parents, you can, in reward, you hopefully feel what it feels like to be a good person and to be kind and go out your way for others, just like, giving a compliment, sharing a smile. I think along the way, you can feel and learn to develop that moral goodness, because like it's like even though I don't follow God's word anymore and I'm not like a Christian, it's like I'm still a kind person. And it's like it's because I developed that, I guess, when I was, in learning about Christianity and just developing a personality and who I am. Like becoming a kind person is something that doesn't have to be associated with religion, but I think in my instance, it's something that developed along the way, and I've had to just kind of make it my own. Like, who do I relay this kindness to, and something like that.
Yeah, thank you. And for many people, as they move away from a religious worldview, for some of them, they've really got to rework this stuff quite hard, because if their morality was very much based in their religion and now they've lost their faith, it can feel like they're starting from scratch again. But I don't get that sense from you, because that intuitive sense of kindness was core to the way you thought about it in a religious context. I presume you just sort of kept that stuff as you moved away from being a Christian. Were there any other sort of shifts in how you thought about good and bad and right and wrong as you went on that journey away from Christianity, or was it just sort of keeping the good bits?
I think some of the bad has been skewed because there are times, like I'm not saying revenge is the best, but there are times where you do have to put yourself down, and sometimes you are labeled like a bad person or a villain in someone's eyes. And I think politics has shown a lot of that in my eyes. Like I pray on the downfall of my governor like all the time, and in Governor DeSantis in Florida, because like I mean he's ruined so much of Florida. And it's not just him, it's like many people that have come to that. And it's like I don't, in their eyes, I don't want to be considered a good person. And I think that's also just developed as my politics have, because I don't think, you know, goodness and kindness should be extended to people who are actively like harming, marginalized groups. In our case, talking about animals, like corporations. There are a lot of bad people in the world, and I don't think like my kindness should extend to them. Would that probably be what the church would say, be kind to everyone? That might go against what they say, but it's a good thing I'm not in church anymore, because I might sound like a bad person the way I talk about some like government officials or corporations, or just people that are actively harming like large groups at a time. And so
Yeah,
I think I took some of the bad traits, but I think, I
you
make them
took a bit
work
of
in a
the fire.
sense
You took
where,
some of the fire and
yeah,
brimstone as well. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. Thank you. Well, you've hinted at it already, but let's come on to the second part of this question, which is obviously central to the sentientism idea, which is who matters. Because you could have the most impressive philosophical, ethical system you like, right? But if you're arbitrarily excluding people you shouldn't be excluding, or arbitrarily excluding beings you shouldn't be excluding, I think you've made a fundamental error, right? So this moral scope question of who matters is really important to me. So again, that would be another really interesting journey to understand, from childhood up till now, about how do you think about that question of moral scope. So growing up, most people will start with yourself and family and then friends around you. And as you learn more about the world, your scope might extend to other bits of humanity and maybe even all of it. But what's your journey been about thinking about who should matter when you're wondering about who to be kind to?
I think obviously like going vegan in 2019, it wasn't an overnight decision. It was something where I had two vegan friends in high school, and they were like phenomenal influences in like me going vegan. My best friend was also questioning veganism, vegetarianism at the time. She was doing more hands-on things like cooking, and she was like, whoa, this is like kind of crazy. I'm like boiling a crab alive right now. And I think like in conjunction with those two things, and then the final nail in the hammer, like nail in the coffin, was like a class I took during my community college time. I was still living in Pensacola. It was before I graduated with my associates and transferred to a university. And I didn't do much on campus, but I did take this one class. It was a public speaking class, and we had to watch a documentary. I don't even remember why anymore, but it was What the Health. And I remember watching it, and I was like, yeah, they're kind of making some points. Like, I think generally speaking, like I mentioned it in my article, like watching a documentary isn't the same as like talking to someone that's vegan and or vegetarian, and like learning how it works for them. Personally, like talking to people of color that are also vegan or vegetarian, asking like, how is this in such a what is seen as like such a white like demographic of being vegan. Like, what is it like being a person of color in this? Are you still able to find foods to connect with your culture? Are you like chastised by your family? So I was like learning all of these things. And then like I tell people all the time, like I don't think at first I went vegan for the animals. I was curious a lot about health, and then animal activism and advocacy came along the way. I think that What the Health 100% helped, because a lot of these things, a lot of the documentaries I feel like do focus on animal advocacy, and a lot don't inherently talk about like health at first. It might be more of like a 50-50 or 60-40, but I feel like from what I remember from What the Health, I haven't watched it again since it was very much talking about health. And I know that there's like a predisposed likelihood that like Black Americans are more likely to develop high blood pressure. Like seeing my dad literally have high blood pressure like very often in my life. It's like I know that there's heart disease, there's diabetes, there's things that, African Americans are more predisposed to growing up. So I knew like health reasons, this is something I should think of for the future. At the time I told myself, maybe when I'm 30, I'll go vegan or something like that. And, in conjunction with just like having these friends that were vegan, I could ask them for tips. I had to, Google the World Wide Web at my tips of my fingers. And it's like, I was like, okay, maybe I could try this out now. I think from there, the moral aspects came in, and I was like, okay, well, I kind of want to learn more about like sanctuaries and why animal activist groups are so, I'm trying to say, like, think of what to say. Like, I guess, like, why it is controversial to go to zoos or to SeaWorld, or, like, everyone was around for what, Black Rock, I think is what it was called, the documentary.
Blackfish.
Blackfish. I'm just randomly naming it. Like,
Yeah.
close, but not.
Yeah.
Blackfish, just like, thinking about, how these documentaries were considered something big in pop culture at the moment, but it's not something I knew from an animal activism lens. It was more so of like a pop culture lens, like kind of newsy, like knowing what about it, but from a very surface level versus like, a lens of someone working in animal advocacy and like how these are important issues. Just because, I mean, growing up in a Jamaican and Caribbean, Trinidadian household, also in the South, it's like so much that I consumed was meat. So I never stopped to think more about like, how much meat I'm eating, how much I'm consuming actively, like, hurting the environment and animals, and what can I do as an individual to go from there.
Yeah, thank you. And before that journey, how did you think about non-human animals as a kid? Did you have animals in your home, or did you think more broadly about animals at that stage, or were you sort of an animal person, or not so much?
So I was fascinated by animals. Like I remember when I was able to check out books out the library at my school, I always picked up books about dogs and cats and species. Like I loved learning so much about dog breeds and not so much cat breeds. I think it's just more the pictures of the cats in general. I grew up with more interest in the dogs, and then my dad brought home like what he deemed as mutts, which I just like eventually learned like that's just a dog that's has multiple breeds or whatever. But he picks up dogs from like the pound, the local animal shelter, or like the flea market, always had animals. We eventually got a cat when I was maybe sometime in high school. I want to say maybe I was 16, 17. And that was like my first time interacting with a cat. And I really liked like having like animals in my home as a kid. I don't think like they were ever really indoor animals, which I learned was also like a bad thing way after the fact. Just like, how with cats, leaving them outside, they're more susceptible to, a lot more diseases. They can lead to a lot of bird extinctions, things like that. With dogs, I mean, they can run away, also be susceptible to things outside. It doesn't really, you don't form a bond with these companion animals. Like at that point, they're just there. So I think that was like my first interaction with animals when I was younger, but I truly didn't realize like what it was like to have like, I don't know, a companion pet like living in my home until 2020 when I got my cat. But yeah, my cat died in March of last year, which feels like so
Oh,
long
sorry.
ago, but it's okay. I actually got him 2021 because I'm trying to remember it was 2 years with him. So yeah, it was very sweet. Learned a lot about responsibility, a lot about just like how to talk about an animal that's living in your home versus like ownership. I think ownership and a lot about animals is so much in morality and like not to get ahead of myself, but I think a lot of language like that would be nice to learn as a child, but just like learning about how to speak about an animal like a pet, like using the term companion. I don't have anything against people that call their animals their pets because it's like it's I guess like something I've learned along the way with going vegan. That companion just feels like, you are acknowledging the bond you have like with that animal versus it just like being like an ownership thing. But now that I think about it, I think a lot of that ties into how we view animals, like ownership and like property and such, because I feel like I'm getting ahead of myself, but yeah, I do feel like there is some link there about just how you talk about them.
Yeah, too right. Yeah. The transition you went through, you described it already, but how challenging was it for you, both, psychologically, but also socially with friends and family? Because as you said, it's somewhat for almost everybody, you're fighting against some pretty powerful social norms. And then you have the particular challenges of, the particular groups or cultures or society you're part of. But it also feels like you were going through that journey at the same time as some other big transitions about moving away from religion and working through realizing you're queer and so on. It felt like you were probably trying to do all of those transitions at once. How did that feel? And did it feel like there were some, were those transitions, were there links between them in some way, or were they just sort of separate things you were working through?
I think a lot of them were tied to each other. I think a lot of it was coming into my Black identity. I think I was kind of learning about like how I do love that I grew up in a Black church and like I learned so much from church. Like, I mean, hearing myself talk about like learning kindness and developing morality through biblical texts and saying that out loud probably for the first time is like making me think, oh, another good thing about church. But I harbored so much like anger and bitter like resentment towards just church. And I feel like this has been the first year where I've been like, I'm actually so grateful. I like learned how to play music and like was in church choir and like developed relationships in the church, like with friends and family. And I can like look back and, thank 2019 for, or not 2019, like the age of 19 for being so difficult because like it wasn't just religion like coming out as queer and I was just so conflicted. I'm like, well, I don't know what this means for me, especially like being in a heterosexual relationship. I don't know what that means and how to navigate that, kind of just things I have to take at a time. Going vegan, like it felt like I was questioned by people like, are you sure? Do you know, are you sure that's a good decision? Just because like I will admit I don't take the vitamins I need to. There is some health things you have to learn about yourself going vegan. Sometimes you just learn them throughout the way. Like, sometimes you do learn that the absence of red meat means you're iron deficient and having those problems already, like that's just something you learn then. Maybe you learn like, oh, you really have to eat your leafy greens or mushrooms or things you don't really technically eat. And
Get
I
your
think like,
B12, whatever it is. Yeah.
yeah, your B12 and vitamin D and iron are like the things I am so sufficient in because of what, I mean, going vegan. And it's like learning all of this at once, going through these identity things and then adding a dietary change, especially big restrictions in a very small like city town where there's not a lot of options to eat. It forced me to cook a lot and become like a lot more responsible with like my health and things I was eating. I think all of them were tied to each other just because I kind of I was done with high school. I was middle of community college. And the reason I was there was because I didn't know what I wanted to do the rest of my life. Now I'm looking back, I see why people wait and go to college when they're like 24, 25, when their frontal lobe, their prefrontal cortex is like, I don't know, like developing because I mean, no wonder I didn't know what I wanted to do at 19. I was busy going through all of those identity changes. I'm happy I chose journalism. I'm glad writing was like something that felt like it resonated with me and that could express my thoughts and emotions. more clearly than speaking. And so it felt like I was kind of channeling all of these things I was going through per se and like encountering in life and at the age of 19. And I could actually like learn how to write about them and how to use these experiences. I mean, like these are experiences I'm writing about 5 years later now, and now I can actually thoroughly talk about how I was developing personality and like liking my alone time, like how I view myself, how I feel perceived by other people. It was rough at the time, and I do see all of them as connected, and I'm glad I can explain them more today.
Yeah. Yeah. Look back a little bit more clearly with some hindsight. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. And
I would, sorry, I feel like there's a part I didn't touch on. I feel like when it comes to going vegan, I did mention like how people were like, "Are you sure this is good for you?" I think like I've written a lot about just how ostracized from like, barbecues, reunions, cookouts, like a family dinner, like home cooked meals. A lot of it isn't fun, and it's not like a feeling I felt like I was devastated by. It was just like, okay, well, how can I change this? Like I can't live my life letting people just feel bad for me or struggle to find things that are vegan or just like not sure what to do. So I had to figure out how I can do that. So, sometimes it's offering to bring frozen burgers to barbecue. Sometimes it's eating before and just politely declining everything you're offered that is not vegan. Sometimes it's like inviting your friends and family and loved ones to like vegan restaurants or vegan places. And I mean, people know me as always having good recommendations and good food. I
that
mean,
helps.
like
Yeah.
yeah, it helps. It's like I feel like I have crafted my own way of getting around like the social awkwardness of being vegan and just like the little bit of ostracization. I think what I'm looking for to do more of is like kind of being a little bit more vocal about like what I've learned while going vegan. I feel like I shared a lot with like my close friends that are vegan. Like a lot of us just talk about how like the dietary change has honestly changed into like a lifestyle thing that has revolutionized politics, their personal politics, and like the way they move about their lives. And I feel like I have those conversations more with maybe super close friends or people that I don't feel like I am pushing this like agenda onto, because it's not an agenda the way I'm saying it. I'm not like, okay, I'm going to take this fork out of your hand and replace it with like a fork that has tofu on it. It's not something like that. But I think having conversations more openly about like how removing animal products from my diet has like mentally made me feel better. Like it makes me feel like maybe not per se healthier, but it just makes me feel like a little more like I developed a moral compass thanks to that, and just like how we should be treating like animals differently.
Yeah. Thank you. And did the journey with veganism and thinking about non-human animals differently, how did that shift the way you think about intrahuman ethics? I mean, you mentioned, rethinking your politics and so on. Was there a link there as well, or was the animal thing a sort of just a separate project, if you like?
It definitely piqued my interest in environmentalism and anything related to food politics and food justice. I think from veganism, I was introduced to groups like PETA or groups that are more like focused on Black, Indigenous people of color, like Apex advocacy, like thinking, like finding more groups that are aligned with animal advocacy, but also not letting that be the stop of their mission, like also environmentalism, also trying to talk about how farm workers are underpaid and aren't getting the benefits that they deserve for being the ones like, picking strawberries. I know that so many people, so many food workers, mainly like people that are immigrants and people of color, are taken advantage of in like factory farm settings or in field workers or anything. And it's like, I feel like a lot of vegans, a lot of vegetarians, a lot of people in the community of animal advocacy are not aligning that with their politics and their justice. And that's like a big problem that I've talked about, like in as far as missing the intersectionality of veganism, because it's like, how are you also not focused on the people that are actively involved in this? It's like, I can't place my blame on the people that are employed at these corporations that are just doing manual labor because they have to, especially because they're underpaid and that's the only job they have. Like I think including them and like the liberation for animals is also important, and just like showing the kindness to them as well, because to them that's a job. They're not doing, like Tyson workers, I can't remember what, but I mean they have gone through so much. I mean during the height of the pandemic, they were getting sick. A lot of them were, like people can get in accidents and lethal accidents as well in the factories. And it's like, I have to, like, you have to come off your high horse as a vegan vegetarian when you're in the fight for these, like ending factory farming. And you have to stop and think, like, also, how is this going to be affecting like farm workers, and how can we make, safer work conditions. So I don't know. I don't want to get too lost on my plot, but I think I had to learn a lot about like, how there are vegan industries and, industries like, everyone knows almond milk is not the best for the environment. Same with palm oil. And it's just like, just because I'm vegan doesn't mean I'm 100% saving the earth, and there is nothing like, individually that I can't do or like learn about or speak out on, show awareness about.
So
Like
you mean
there's
we haven't
still,
achieved some perfect ethical standard and we can now relax?
surprisingly, no, regardless of what people in and outside the community think.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of environmental issues have become of interest to me because of going vegan. And it's like phenomenal because I like just think like, okay, well, what if I didn't go vegan? Then what would have happened? Why, like, how would I have felt about all of these issues? And when would I have like been thinking more about climate justice and environmentalism, and just like how there's so much like racism and sexism and classism, homophobia, all of it is still involved in all of these things.
Yeah. Well, that's a perfect segue to the final, also crazily difficult question. How do we make a better world? So I'd love to dig into some of the more detailed stuff about, how writing, for example, can play a role in making a better world, how different forms of activism might work and what the problems or the opportunities might be, how we might see different cultures or different groups shifting in different ways, or what the blockers might be. So it'd be good to dig into that. But I don't know if you wanted to start with, do you have any sort of big picture view about a sort of utopian vision for how we might make a better world? And this isn't just non-human animals. This is for all of the human animals too, given the problems we face.
Mm-hmm. I think I was just looking at my article because I'm like, what did I say about this? Because I definitely talked so much about the future in the third part of the article, the final part. But I think it's really phenomenal that I have to shout out Apex Advocacy. Like I got to meet the team when they came to Black Veg Fest in New York about like a month and a half ago. And it's just like incredible what their foundation is doing. I wish there were more nonprofits in the world like them that were just like also focusing on human liberation and just collective liberation for all, regardless of race, gender, class, where you come from, where you are living. Just because I think this
It's like
kind of,
unashamedly universal, isn't it? It's like
yes.
everybody, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's like that's how it should be, not just like, we can't just limit animal advocacy to non-human animals. We do have to mention those extents, like what I said, like what about the farm workers? What about like the people who you might not want to think about that are committing these, harsh things towards these animals? Like, unfortunately, as bad as it does feel, because they're enacting these factory farming crimes, like I do have to still think about them and like their realities, because I mean at the end of the day I'm blaming corporations and the CEOs for these things, and the people that are the reason that we have these factory farms that are, killing animals at like a crazy like levels to where you do not need that much food to consume. And so I have to think about like, how they're like Apex's famous like collective liberation for all is something that, I want to move forward with in my thinking, because I mean, thinking about how it's tied to abolition, like prison abolition, and just like justice for people that are incarcerated, that, are locked up for petty crimes or things that, there could be restorative justice for. I think a lot of that is in this like perfect utopia that I I think a lot of the concepts of Afrofuturism that I've learned through, I could think about books like Octavia Butler or Janelle Monáe's Dirty Computer, just like thinking about these concepts of Afrofuturism and how they could be involved in our politics of like making a better world. I think a lot of my politics are like so very left leaning that it's like a lot of that does include like some kind of better way to treat non-human animals, like whether it is phenomenally like ending factory farming, but still figuring out how Native Americans can still like indigenous people can still, consume animals like they should, like they historically have, and not feeling like, veganism is shutting down like who and what can consume animals and how that works. Like I feel like there has to be, I think I mentioned earlier, but just getting off the pedestal of like feeling like there is this perfect way to live and to also just like policing how others live as well. I think that there is no vegan that should be telling indigenous people what to do with animals. I don't think like I don't think that's the way to talk to people about veganism and animal liberation. I think a lot of it needs to come from a place of meeting people where they are and understanding that ending factory farming might not end like animal consumption. It might just put it in a way that is better for the earth, better for the animals, better for the people that are working those at those places. And I think that is like the start of where we could be. I don't know exactly what a perfect world could be like because there are groups of marginalized people I'm not thinking of. Like, I don't know how there's like a perfect and better world that is fully accessible for disabled people, for children, for older people. It's just like that's the beauty of knowing other organizers and just like talking to people, because you do come across like, I don't know. I was not to get too off topic, but I was listening to a TikTok yesterday that was talking about how this woman felt so ashamed that she didn't know on a personal level any of the older people that she lives near in the Florida area, where she's near one of the largest old people, like elder communities. And I'm assuming she's talking about the Villages, because if you know Florida lore, the Villages is like retirement villa. Like it's a gigantic place near Orlando that is literally strictly for older people. And like thinking about that makes me be like, damn, I really need to talk to my neighbors more. I need to get names and at least just like a phone number or something, because in the case of emergency, community is all we have. And I think her TikTok really touched me because there are so many things I don't think about in whether the case of natural disaster, getting in touch with the community, trying to plan something like a block party, or just getting to know your neighbors on a very basic level. And whether it's in case of emergency or not, a lot of it is thinking about people that you don't interact with on the daily, like how is this future going to be fit for older people or for children? Like I mentioned, like I don't know that answer at the point. That's me needing to talk to more people, or needing to read more books, or just consume more media about like disabled people or children or older people, and just like how we can have and develop this utopia in the future that is collective liberation for all.
Yeah, I like the strapline. Thank you. And so there's some themes there. There's the collective liberation for all, which in part implies, because it's about liberation, it's not something you're going to force on other people. You want to respect where they're coming from and the path they want to find and what they want to follow. And there's humility there as well, right? Because we don't know what's best for other groups and other people. So there's a sort of openness there. And it does leave some points of tension, of course, because you talked about the challenges of marginalized groups, for example, where, they don't have the choices that you and I have, for example. And the tension, I think, is, there are harms being done by those groups to innocent non-human animals. And those things matter. I don't think we should forget that or push that to one side or deny it. Those are real harms. But I think maybe the more productive approach is to respect the people within those groups who understand their context, because they probably also have some of the same sorts of concerns that you and I do as vegans. And quite often in the conversations I've had, it's opened my eyes that almost in every human culture today and historically, there are themes that tap into compassion for non-human animals. So whether it's the idea of ahimsa in the Dharmic religions, or it's ideas of animism that run through loads of different cultures, there are already people in those cultures, in those groups, who recognize non-human animals as sentient beings that should matter in a sense. And often those people are much better placed to find a way forward than someone from the outside, maybe from a naive point of view, shouting at that group to go vegan. So that's the balance I guess I found in my head is, not to erase the suffering and harms because they are still real, but to, help and enable and support people within those groups to find a path that works for them rather than sort of shouting from the outside. But
Absolutely.
it's this weird thing, right? If we're talking about liberation, almost by definition, it's not something you want to impose on people, right? You want to help them find a path to liberation. But yeah, that idea of collective liberation for all is just a deeply challenging but really clean and sort of all-encompassing vision. How do you think about the more pragmatic approaches to making that happen? Because for some people, and you've talked about, I think, your own approach and the approach Apex and others take, it is richly intersectional because they're recognizing, yes, there are loads of different causes. Yes, there are loads of different groups. Yes, there are loads of different individuals. And there's enormous diversity of hierarchies and systems of oppression and, experiences of suffering and victimhood or survivorship. But ultimately, they are linked in quite deep ways, and we need to respond in an integrated way to address those deep problems. Whereas there are others who will say, well, look, the world is a big place. There's so many complex causes. We need to chunk it up, and I'm just going to focus on this one and sort of ignore the rest. What's your sense about how can we handle these difficult topics of so many different cause areas, intrahuman problems we're trying to deal with, and then the non-human animal problem, and how they link and how we should respond to that?
I think a lot of it is meeting people where they are with education. A lot of the times I've talked to people about veganism, they're really wowed by, oh, you can still eat things you enjoy. You can still cook a lot. You don't eat fish. And I'm like, yeah, I don't eat fish. I'm like, it's very surprising. It's very actually so funny when I tell people I'm vegan and they assume I eat fish or like something random. I'm like, no, fish are still animals and they're still, capable of feeling pain and like, very much still meets. So I think meeting people where they are with education, whether it's like, a pamphlet to give, like a website, an article to read, maybe a book recommendation, documentary. I think it's very important. I think I've just like learned things as I go. I don't have like a walking Google Doc, or I should have like a notes app of like recommendations for people. But I think that I definitely try to share my quote unquote gospel of like, how veganism truly has changed my perspective on the world and like people and just how I go about living my life. And so I think like just interacting with others with an open mind is a good start. And just like how I feel like and it's just also hearing people out and being able to listen to their concerns or like something that they deem is like difficult or hard to do, and coming to you like, okay, well, you do have to think so much about like accessibility and how it's a privilege to be vegan. Like I have, although now I feel like I spend a lot less money than I did in the beginning of veganism because, you're trying things out, you're trying to replace chicken and beef and like what your protein is. Like
It's a
you
little bit of a
don't,
like for like, isn't it?
yeah,
You're trying to find matches
yeah.
for, yeah.
Yes. And it's like you have to kind of deconstruct all of that and be like, sometimes you can just have straight vegetables. Like I've never felt more vegan than when I just dive into like a sheet pan of things. And it's like, this is incredible that people like, I don't know, going to restaurants and not just like doing the sheet pan thing and like going to places where they focus on vegetables, like a fully vegan place. Like I visited Pietramala in Philadelphia last week and just seeing the incredible things they do with vegetables. It's like, this is crazy. People are missing out on things like this in their diet and palates just because there's a lot of misconception about how important meat and dairy is in your diet. And I had to like learn about that and unlearn it and just like how that is something that you learn. I mean, literally as a kid, drinking calcium, building your bones and everything like that. And just talking to family members or friends that are like, oh, well, I go to the gym, I need protein. And I'm like, I have someone you can follow because I'm not a gym girly. Like, I don't know how to gain a lot of protein and that, and like, have a plant-based diet that's just protein packed. But I do know an Instagram influencer that does do that. And it's like passing on that things to people because people are concerned. They see, in the news that I remember when COVID first hit the streets in March 2020 and beef was like out of the stores and people didn't know what to do. This is different whether it's like someone that goes to the gym and relies on beef for like protein, or whether it's like a family of four that has a hard time, like, they're having a hard time figuring out like what's for dinner that's also going to feed every single mouth at the dinner table. It's like people are interested in veganism for those things, or for like E. coli passing through vegetable, like lettuce. And then the bird flu, people wanting to like, leave chicken out their diet, all these things that are happening, whether it's because of the United States, like lack of dietary, just like lack of restrictions when it comes to food. People are interested in veganism. Necessarily, it's similar to me. It might not be because of animals, but if I can be an outlet and talk to someone about like how veganism has worked for me for the last 5 years and how I foresee it working for the rest of my life, like maybe I could help, and maybe I can show them something that they're not going to learn from a documentary, they're not going to learn from an article. And those are the little things that are good ways for me on an individual level to start. As far as a bigger level, I think writing the articles is a great thing. I think that is like a great way of showing, a larger audience with facts, like not just me running my mouth. It's also like I'm linking to things. It's being a fact check. It's like I wrote an article for Healthline 3 years or 2 years ago, and it was like verified by a doctor. And it's like it's important to get like these different perspectives that are also backed by science, because a lot of people are like, oh well, I know that calcium is in milk, so where are you going to get that? And it's like, well, there's so many vegetables for that. It's
Yeah, yeah,
actually
yeah.
and you just have to include them more in your diet. So I think a lot of it is word of mouth and just meeting people where they are education wise.
Yeah, thank you. And one of the things I find fascinating is the responses you might get from different groups, because the links between sort of human politics and the animal question of veganism fascinate me. So, in a weird sense, you can see it quite clearly amongst those with quite far right politics, because there are some groups who unashamedly they're about hierarchy, they're about quite open discrimination and disparaging of out groups. They're quite, comfortable with oppression and, those sort of forms of politics amongst groups of humans. So it's sort of understandable that they would naturally apply that to non-human animals as well. And you can see that quite explicitly in a number of spaces where actually the idea of eating meat has become, and drinking milk has become, almost a marker of a far right identity, right? You proudly eat steak. You might even be
Yes.
on the carnivore diet. Some of the white supremacist groups on their marches will chug quarts of milk to demonstrate that they can tolerate lactose, which they see as a sign of civilization, as opposed to the uncivilized people around the world who can't process lactose. So in a way, the far right sees on animal agriculture in some ways as quite an iconic thing. Arguably animal agriculture's land hunger is one of the main drivers for colonialism, right? I mean, that's one of the reasons why you need so much space. So there's a real rich affinity there, as well as some cultural identifiers with the sort of image of the American rancher and bullets, Bible, and beef as being, canonical things that are important. So fine, I can, I understand that. I object to it deeply, but I can see it. But then that leads to a frustration, because when we're talking to other people, right, people, whether they're even more sort of centrist socially or further on the left, as your politics are, or particularly with groups themselves that are the victim of pretty brutal oppression historically and today, there I find a frustration, because you're like, look, you guys should really get this, right? This is pretty obvious, right? We understand hierarchy, we understand oppression, we understand systems of violence. What's your sense been of when you work with and engage with those sorts of groups that are more, culturally liberal, if you like, and who see resisting oppression as a good thing? What's your experience of trying to get them engaged on the animal question and veganism? And do you sort of share that frustration, or do you think there's, real productive change that's just about to happen around the corner with those groups?
Okay, this is actually such a fun question because my friend and I got dinner once and we were kind of surprised that more leftists, more liberal, self-proclaimed people like with more left-leaning politics aren't vegan or vegetarian.
Yeah.
I think it also ties a lot into, I see a lot of people asking very correct questions about why a lot of leftist people, again, with more left-leaning politics, don't believe in masking, wearing like a face mask during like protests or rallies. Like there's not as much of a push for helping out people that are disabled or immunocompromised. And I think there's a connection there. Like stick with me because I'm going to try and get to it. But I think there are certain parts of politics that you don't 100%, I guess, feel applies to you. And I'm not saying every leftist should be a vegan because, again, there's accessibility, there's things that culturally don't mean, as much to you. I do think that it would be more beneficial for politics, like left-leaning politics, and also the movement towards collective liberation if more people with left-leaning politics did include animal liberation in their politics and in their praxis. Like I think that would be one so much stronger for the movement, of course. But I think it made me start thinking about it because I think someone asked Kamala, and I don't mean like in an interview, I think just in like maybe it was like a tweet or a TikTok or an article or something, but what it would be like if like the president did include more policies that protected animals into their plan when it comes to election. Because I think one thing I really enjoyed reading, I don't know, remember whose article it was in the Vox package, but I do think that a lot more politicians, but people involved in politics also need to address animal liberations and animal protection laws, anything regarding animal welfare, because I think there, one, are so many groups you're, discounting for when it comes to at least obtaining and securing a vote. But when it comes to getting support in general, when it comes to more like people with left-leaning politics and their interests in animal liberation, it might not seem like non-human animals can fit into that sector of like the liberation that they're fighting for when it comes to human liberation, which is okay. I don't think everyone's politics will get there or need to get there. I think there are some things people can focus on more, and we can leave like animal liberation, animal welfare to people that are more passionate about it. And that's the thing about like collaborating with other organizers that I think is great, because there are some, again, I mentioned earlier, I could be a lot more knowledgeable in disability justice and just like what that looks like for the future, and like how everything I do can be better for immunocompromised people and people that are disabled, and how like fighting for a better future includes them as well. But I think that I think it would be great for more groups, leftist groups, to also work with animal rights organizations. Of course, that does entail like these animal rights organizations also being willing to understand that more left-leaning politics is the answer, like not begging Republicans or people to change the laws that they are actively not going to care about. I mean, if I'm an animal activist and I'm begging someone like a politician who is taking away reproductive freedoms from women and people that, can have children or choose to not have children, I don't think I'm going to be begging them for animal rights and animal welfare, because there's not a point. I think at some point you have to realize you have to collaborate with people that are, looking to better the world, hoping for more liberation for humans. And you also have to introduce them to why like liberation for non-human animals is also something that could, not like deviate from that, but also be something that is wrapped up in the politics of what you're fighting for anyways.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you. And I guess the way I think about it is, people and groups will need to and should focus to some degree, right? We can't all do everything equally, but at the very least, we should have a basic understanding of some of the other problems that people are trying to address around the world so that we can collaborate. And at the very least, we shouldn't needlessly perpetuate some of the other forms of oppression, even if we're not, that's not the one we're particularly working on. To the extent it's possible, we shouldn't be involved in other forms of oppression, even if our chosen focus is a different one. So that, I think, that still leaves space for people to focus and specialize and concentrate in different areas, but at least have an eye open to this sort of broader philosophy, like you said, whether it's collective liberation for all or something else. But it feels strange because in many social justice movements, it does, and in environmentalism as well, it still feels like there's quite a strong taboo against addressing the animal question. And sometimes that's because people are worried about losing focus on their particular cause, so they don't want to add extra stuff, which I can understand. They don't want to lose focus. But sometimes it is a deeper thing. It's just like a deeper level of societal indoctrination and discrimination that they don't want to face up to, and which is frustrating because it seems like a strong taboo. But at the same time, most humans do have an intuitive and often quite deep, understanding about what it might be like to be a non-human animal, and they do care, right? I mean, you can see it in terms of the public reaction when, some celebrity kicks a cat or some other, or a wild animal is struggling, right? Or a pig, jumps out of a truck on its way to the slaughterhouse, right? The public outcry in support of that being is overwhelming and phenomenal. But, then all of those people go and buy a bacon sandwich for lunch. So it's a strange dichotomy where I can see that humanity has sort of potentially got this latent ethics that means we really do care about ultimately collective liberation. But then there's all of these social norms and, practical blockers that are getting in the way. So I'm not sure whether to feel sort of pessimistic or optimistic. I mean, how do you feel overall when you sort of look at these causes? Are you in a more of a doomerist camp or a naive optimist camp or something in the middle as we look to wrap up?
I feel like I'm somewhere in the middle. Like, I don't have the greatest outlook of the world and what's next for us. I think like anyone that has paying attention to the news, and I mean in a very general, not in a general sense, like very like, regional news, whether it's about climate or just like the future of America's politics in the next literal month, or just like, what's going on in like Palestine right now. I don't think that there is the brightest vision for what's next in my worldview, and like what could individuals are doing on like a small level that can actually feel like it's like going towards something. But I do also on the flip hand think that as an individual there's so only so much we can do, and like those little actions do make you feel better. At the end of the day, talking about kindness again, I think whether it's like just showing kindness to others, showing kindness to non-human animals, choosing to try out veganism or vegetarianism, and to take the politics you learn from like, being kind to animals and not consuming them, and to like treating them like they are like, a living being, because they are, and kind of taking that with you and figuring out like, okay, well, if this is how I can slowly change my thinking about one thing, maybe I can do that with politics or with, climate or environmentalism or just like food justice, and thinking about all of these things. Because I don't know, I tell people all the time, like, there's like a pipeline that I had to going vegan to changing my politics. And I'm so grateful for it, because like, I truly don't know like the person I'd be today if I didn't go vegan and be exposed to like so many different sides of food justice and food sovereignty, environmentalism, climate justice. Like, I don't even know who I'd be if it weren't for that. Only because of a dietary change.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? It's one of those topics where, it might feel a bit niche or a bit marginal, and you experiment and then it sort of draws you in, and, it's like a revelation, changes your whole worldview in some sense, and in quite a deep, powerful way. So, yeah. Well, it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. Is there anything else you wanted to add in? I think we've done quite well because we've answered what's real, who matters, and how to make a better world in 90 minutes. But is there anything else you wanted to add in? But also, how can people follow you, keep up to date with your work, come and listen to you DJing, read your articles?
Oh my gosh, you can find me so many ways. Just on the street, on the street in New York. I'm outside a lot, so I'm always doing something. But seriously, I don't think I have anything else to add, because I have talked so much, and now my brain's gonna just sit here reeling and thinking about our conversation. But I most likely the best reachable via the internet. You can find me and my work and any way to contact me through my website, which is noellawilliams.com. My portfolio is there. So not everything I've written, but most of the things I am very proud of that I've written are on there. More info about like how to reach me or like the book I'm working on or anything regarding like any articles to either like write about or anything I would have mentioned, especially the Vox articles linked there. A link to my Substack, my occasional newsletter that I work on is also there too. I'm in Brooklyn if anyone wants to actually find me, preferably if you tell me you're trying to find me first.
Yeah, rather than just
um
randomly on a
yeah,
street corner. Yeah.
yeah, I'm like, oh, okay. But I also on Instagram, noella.jpg, like you would find at the end of a photo. I'm on Twitter, YO Noella, so yo Noella. Yeah, and I think either of those three places you find me on the internet can lead you to any more of my work or anything regarding me, honestly.
That's great. Thank you. Well, I'll put links in the show notes so people can click
Thank
through and
you.
follow you. But it's been such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you again. And thanks for
Thank
that
you
great article
so
that proved
much.
our introduction. And say hi to Marina when you speak to her next. So,
I will. Thank
yeah,
you.
cool. Well, yeah, again, good luck to you and the rest of Florida for the rest of the day. And thank you so much for being a guest on Sentientism. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you everyone for listening.
Cheers.